Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a pretty fundamental crisis right at the heart of psychiatry. It's a crisis that makes us question the very words we use to talk about our minds. We're going to look at a pretty radical idea that suggests our current maps of the mind aren't just a little bit wrong, they might be the wrong shape entirely.
So let's jump right in with this quote. Now, this isn't some critique from an outsider. This is a frankly stunning admission from the former head of the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health, basically the most powerful psychiatric research organization in the world. He's saying the Bible of his own field lacks validity. Think about that. The core problem we're exploring is that the critique is coming from inside the house.
So, part 1, psychiatry's validity crisis. What does that actually mean? Let's start breaking it down and see exactly where the cracks in the foundation are starting to show.
And wow, it gets even more stark. Another former director of the NIMH, Stephen Hyman, called the diagnostic manual an epistemic prison. I mean, just let that sink in. The very leaders of the field felt trapped by their own system, and they believed it was literally holding back scientific progress. That is a huge statement.
So here's the deal. When you actually look at the evidence, all those neat little diagnostic boxes start to dissolve. Philosophers will tell you that disorders aren't natural kinds. You can't find a nugget of bipolar in nature like you can find a nugget of gold. Then, geneticists are finding this massive overlap between conditions we all thought were separate, like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Researchers have even found something called a P-factor, which points to a single general vulnerability to pretty much all forms of mental distress. And maybe the biggest piece is, we now know that so-called psychotic experiences are on a spectrum that exists in the entire population, not just in some separate sick group. The bottom line is, the categories just don't match reality.
Now for part 2, the geometry of consciousness. And this is where things get really fascinating, because the problem might not be about just drawing better boxes. The real issue here might actually be one of shape and of dimension.
Just pause and really think about this question. What if our brains are working in a geometry that our diagnostic tools can't even perceive? It's kind of like trying to measure the volume of a basketball with only a flat ruler. You just can't. You're missing a whole dimension. And this brings us to a really central insight for this whole explainer. Our mental states are operating in higher dimensions than our diagnoses can possibly capture.
And look, this isn't just some philosophical thought experiment. This is based on real Nobel Prize-winning research. Scientists discovered that for your brain to map something as basic as the room you're in right now, it creates a complex, high-dimensional, donut-like shape called a torus. So, if mapping a simple physical space needs that kind of geometry, what kind of mind-bending geometry is needed to map our entire inner world of thoughts, emotions, and memories?
So what exactly is a torus? Well, at its simplest, it's a donut. The really key thing to understand about it is that you can move along its surface in a continuous spiral. You can loop around and come back to a place that feels really familiar, but you're not in the exact same spot. You're on a different loop of the journey. It's a way of returning to a theme without just repeating the past.
And this right here illustrates the core mismatch perfectly. On the left, you have psychiatry's map. It's flat, it's two-dimensional boxes and straight lines. And on the right, you have the actual territory of consciousness, high-dimensional, dynamic, and full of spirals. Now think about what this means for a word like relapse. In that flat 2D world, a relapse is a failure. You're right back at square one. But in the spiral model, a return isn't a failure at all. It's part of a transformation. You're coming back to a similar theme, sure, but with new experience from a different point on the spiral.
Okay, so let's move on to the solution. Part 3, a new field-based framework. This is all about building a completely new architecture for understanding the mind, one that isn't based on static boxes, but on dynamics, and on the field of relationships and resources that's all around a person.
At the heart of this new model is this simple but really powerful formula. Your express capacity, which is basically how well you're able to thrive, is equal to your native capacity minus the constraints, or the total load on your system. The boat analogy here is perfect. Think of your native capacity as the size and strength of your boat. The constraints are the size of the waves. Your express capacity is just how well your boat is managing to navigate that storm. So this leads to a complete therapeutic inversion, a total flip. The conventional approach often tries to make things better by suppressing the load, right? By using medication to try to make the waves smaller. The field-based approach, though, focuses on increasing your native capacity. It's about building a bigger, stronger boat to handle whatever waves come your way.
And this points to another key idea, that maybe many of our conventional treatments are accidentally interrupting a natural healing process that just needs support.
This new framework also gives us something really cool. You can think of it as a dynamic weather report for the mind. It's called the harmonic coefficient. And instead of a simple healthy versus sick divide, it's a whole spectrum of coherence. The radio dial analogy is great here. Way down at the bottom where H is negative, you get the chaotic static of psychosis. Turn the dial up to H equals 0, and you get silence, the flat dissonance of depression. But as you move up into the positive numbers, the signal starts to come in clearer. That's healing. At H equals 1, you've hit that perfect sweet spot of coherence, a flow state. But if you turn the dial too far, you get that piercing, overwhelming feedback loop, which is a really interesting way to understand mania. See, it's a spectrum of dynamics, not a list of diseases.
Okay, part 4, reframing mental distress. With this new map in hand, we can start to look at familiar experiences of distress in a radically different, and honestly, a much more hopeful light.
Let's take psychosis, one of the most feared states of mind. The conventional view basically sees a broken brain that's spitting out meaningless symptoms that need to be suppressed. The field-based view sees something entirely different. It sees a system that's been completely overwhelmed by its load. The load has just exceeded its capacity for containment. But, and this is so crucial, it sees it as a meaningful process of reorganization that is actually trying to find a new, more stable state. This is a radical shift, and it's our next big insight. What we call symptoms are often meaningful processes, not just mistakes.
And this leads to an incredibly profound takeaway. The very same internal process of dissolution, of falling apart, can lead to a devastating breakdown if there isn't enough support. But with an adequate container, with safety, with understanding, with human connection, that exact same process can become a life-changing breakthrough. The outcome depends less on what's happening inside you and way more on the environment that's holding you. So, does this idea of building a better container actually work in the real world? Is it just a nice theory? Well, this number, 83%, it represents a really powerful test case. In Finland, they developed an approach called open dialogue, which focuses on building exactly this kind of relational container for people in crisis.
And the results, they're just astounding. 83% of people who go through a first psychotic episode are back at work or in school within 5 years. And, get this, most of them do it without needing to be on long-term medication. This is just a dramatic improvement over standard care, and it powerfully demonstrates our fourth key insight. The conditions around you, your field, are often what determine your outcome.
So what's the lesson from this incredible success story? You can really boil it down to this simple, powerful idea. The active ingredient here, the treatment, isn't a molecule, it's relationship. And the mechanism of healing isn't suppression, it's containment.
So let's bring it all home. Part 5, what this new paradigm means. What are the big picture takeaways from this whole new way of looking at the mind and its struggles? We've really touched on 5 big ideas that are all converging from different independent fields of research. So let's recap them. 1. Our minds work in higher dimensions than our flat diagnosis can capture. 2. Symptoms are often meaningful attempts at healing, not just random noise. 3. Consciousness isn't just brain chemistry. It exists in a whole field of relationships and environment. 4. As we saw with open dialogue, that field around you is absolutely critical to your outcome. And finally, 5. Our best-intentioned treatments might sometimes get in the way of natural healing if they only focus on suppression instead of building capacity. The source material we've been drawing on today ends with this really poetic and powerful line. For so long, psychiatry has only had boxes to put people in. This new framework, though, offers a labyrinth, a path of transformation that has twists and turns for sure, but it leads somewhere meaningful. And that leaves us with one last, really provocative thought to sit with. What if healing isn't actually about silencing our minds or fighting against ourselves? What if it's really about building the capacity to finally understand the messages our minds are trying to send us?
Thanks so much for digging into this with us. This has been The Explainer.